Well, I absolutely agree with you that mainstream media is mum on the topic. The bluefin tuna is the most frightening information in the recent month or so. That tuna was caught 5 months after the accident. So it was caught in August of last year. But the researchers didn't publish that. They wanted to wait until the data was published before they warned us. But that tuna spawned in Japan and then immediately started heading toward the U.S. So it didn't stay in that high radiation field very long, and still when it hit here, you're right, it had both cesium-134 and 137 in it. That means it's a Fukushima signature.
Yes.
And no cesium is good cesium.
Well, so that thing, I did not know that until this moment. It was caught 5 months after the March 11th accident, and we're just now hearing about it.
Right, and it likely only was in Japanese waters for around a month after the accident, and the last 4 months was swimming across the ocean and growing. So, had it been caught off of Japan, the concentration of cesium would be a lot higher because there's a lot less mass as it swam across the ocean. It ate a little bit more as it came.
Yeah, and one of them that they had tagged, I don't know how they did that or what was the motivation, but apparently it made 2 round trips in 600 days.
These tuna, they went 15 for 15. Every tuna they caught had cesium. This isn't just a single tuna. They tested 15, and all 15 tested positive. So that basically means that every tuna in the Pacific now is carrying cesium-134 and 137. So I think that number is going to go up. I think that the concentrations of cesium are going to grow up over the next couple of years. This is not a one-time occurrence, I don't believe. No threshold, and the more you get, the worse it is. But there is no number below which you're safe, and I think that's what this tuna is showing us. That first of all, it's going up. I'm firmly convinced that when somebody else steps forward now and publishes, we're going to see higher numbers than what was already detected. And second, there is no de minimis number below which you're safe. You said it at the beginning of the hour. They put 54 nuclear units in likely the worst location in the world as far as earthquakes go, tsunamis go. I was in Japan. I wrote a book in Japanese on the book tour, and the plants are built right on the ocean, and right behind them, mountains just take right off. There's very little habitable land in Japan, and so you've got high concentrations of people, high concentrations of earthquakes, and high concentrations of nuclear plants, and they just don't go together. So I can understand where the Japanese are really concerned about starting these things back up again. It's interesting because it's being led by mothers, women, which traditionally in the Japanese culture is this is a unique experience that women are stepping up and saying, hell no, we won't go. It's a real change politically.
We were going to have, Arnie, we were going to have a nuclear engineering professor, nor which of the universities in California, because it's a pretty big system, but whichever one it is, they study nuclear engineering. You can narrow it from there. And he was very reticent to, at first, and then I thought, I don't think he's going to do it. So a friend of mine who made this introduction, he eventually said, well, first it was graduation, then he was going to be traveling, and then it was like, nah, I think I'm going to have to bow out of this one. How much pressure do you think is on the professional community, whether it's in academia or whether it is in the actual nuclear industry, to keep quiet? How many billions of dollars are at stake if the people decide we don't want this, turn it off?
Yeah, there's an enormous amount of money that's going into the educational facilities like MIT. MIT has a Tokyo Electric endowed chair on their nuclear faculty. So there's just one example of how pervasive money is. I've been working with researchers who are doing great science. This is not crazy science. This is great science. And they're having an extraordinary difficult time getting their articles published, again, because of industry pressure to downplay the significance of this event. There's trillions of dollars at stake, and whether it's the United States Congress, which is putting enormous pressure on the Nuclear Regulatory Commission not to make these plants in the U.S. any safer. In Japan, it's similar. There's an enormous amount of pressure to get these plants started up before the safety modifications are put in place. It's truly a group of populists versus an enormous amount of money. And I think the jury's still out on who's going to win the struggle in the United States and in Japan. I mean, Europe is, the Germans have decided not to, the Italians have decided not to. There's like a domino effect going on in Europe where people are walking away from nuclear. In Japan and in the United States, there's an awful lot of money on the line, and I think it's going to be a long march.
Now, the way a nuclear power plant works, I mean, do I have this sort of right? You control the heat of the reactor. You get yourself a water source, blow the water over the rods, turn it into steam. Steam turns the turbines, which turn the generators or alternators, whatever they might be, and out goes the power. Is that pretty much it? Yeah, but the heat, when you hear a nuclear plant safely shuts down, what that means is that the nuclear control rods fall into the nuclear reactor and stop the chain reaction. But about 5% of the heat never goes away. And that's the problem with this is that once a uranium atom splits, you only get 95% of the heat from the actual fission. But 5% hangs around in the heat that's generated from all these radioactive pieces. And how much heat is that, Arnie?
Oh, it's enormous. Like 5% doesn't sound like a lot, but Fukushima was each of the Daiichi units were about 3 million horsepower. So 5% of that is 150,000 horsepower. Think about diesel trucks. They're maybe 500 horsepower, 1,000 horsepower when they're running flat out. So you've got hundreds of diesel trucks worth of heat that has to be gotten rid of. And if you don't do that well, it really doesn't matter if the control rods have fallen in or not. You're going to have a meltdown. What
are these control rods made of?
They're made of boron. Boron is really good at absorbing neutrons. They have a cladding on the outside, but really it's nothing like. But 20 multime borax is the boron, and it's a sponge for neutrons and prevents the chain reaction from going on.
So the science has really not changed since Oppenheimer. I mean, this is still old school stuff. It's just the gear looks prettier.
Yeah. Well, and actually, most of the reactors in the United States were built before 1980, and the same in Japan. So not only is it old technology, but they're old reactors. So the average reactor in the United States is 30 years old, as in Japan. We're dealing with equipment now that's starting to show its age, on top of a technology that really hasn't changed in the last 80 years.
This physicist that I mentioned earlier, who shall remain nameless because we could get him in trouble, and I don't want to do that. He would be on the show, except he's not like you or me, and he's probably got a lot of pressure. But the spent fuel rods over there, spent means what? They become what percentage of radioactivity do they have to drop before they're considered spent? Because they're still hot.
Yeah, actually, a new fuel rod is hardly radioactive, and as they become spent, they become more radioactive because they pick up the uranium splits, and the pieces that it splits into are a lot more radioactive than the uranium from which it came. So a spent fuel rod can have just an astronomical amount of radiation. The amount of radiation in the fuel pool at Fukushima Unit 4 is roughly equal to all of the cesium that was exploded in all of the 700 above-ground nuclear tests that we did in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So, a spent fuel pool actually means it's highly radioactive, and it contains an enormous inventory of radioactive, what we call radioactive daughter products.
And so what do we do with our spent rods?
Boy, that's a great question. I think if the United States could answer that question, we'd be out after more nuclear power plants. There's an interesting court case that just came out yesterday, where an appellate court in New York City determined that we don't have a plan. Basically, they threw the NRC's policies back and said, you don't have a plan to store this nuclear fuel. Go back and do it over again. Right now, we're sticking it in these pools, and let's look at Fukushima Daiichi as an example. There are 7 stories in the air, and very heavy, so it's almost like putting a swimming pool on top of a hotel. It's not exactly the ideal place for a large mass like that. So what happens is that the pool contains an enormous amount of radioactivity, and we're keeping it up there because it's cheap. The best thing to do would be to put it into dry casks, which means you take it out of the water and you put it in these heavily shielded, they weigh about over 100 tons. Then you'd set them on the ground where they're a lot less resistant to earthquakes and tsunamis. Fukushima had some dry casks, and they survived just fine. But it's all the fuel that's sitting in these. And actually, the plants in the United States are probably 4 or 5 times worse than that as far as the amount of nuclear waste that's stored in their fuel pools.
Well, I have a bunch of questions to ask you, and we're down to about, I don't know, maybe a minute. But very, very quickly, because I don't want the thing to cut you off, what is reprocessing?
Well, the plan is that reprocessing would strip out the plutonium that's generated, and that could be reburned in another generation of power plants.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep, go ahead.
Well, I'll tell you what. I don't want you to have to give short answers, so just to make sure everybody stays awake tonight, because this is a little bit of a classroom where when they start throwing the terms at us, reprocessing and blah, 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 at least we'll know what they're talking about, because I don't think they do. This is the one, that's just me, I don't think they do. This is the one and only Coast to Coast AM. We shall continue with our Fukushima Forum for this Saturday night. I'm not happy that these fish are contaminated. And the cold streets we roam that are in the lyric there, if I were going to be fanciful and go pre-geriatric hippie, I would say the cold streets that we roam all have exactly the same thing written on their street signs: ignorance. So we admire those who adapt and overcome in the stories that we read and the movies that we watch. But maybe what's on the screen and what's happening in our lives have somehow merged, which means we're going to have to cowboy and cowgirl up and take responsibility for ourselves and for our communities. And the first step is fear nothing. The second step is educate yourselves.
We had an aircraft carrier 100 miles offshore, and